Hey, welcome back, MOOC students. We have another side dish video today, and this one is in response to one of your requests to learn a little bit more of what we sometimes call cultural psychology or cross-cultural psychology. And it turns out that another of my colleagues here at University of Toronto Scarborough, Jessica Dere, has done a lot of research on this topic and is an expert. And so again, rather than me trying to learn stuff, go to somebody who knows it very well. So thank you, Jessica, for spending the time and for agreeing to this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So where I think I want to start, we had a little bit of a chat yesterday in your office about what we might talk about, and you brought up this weird thing, and I think it's really appropriate because it kind of gives students a good sense of where the data that we've been talking about comes from. So could you tell us a little bit about what weird is all about and how it might relate to this issue?
Sure. So a number of authors, I think over the past several decades, really have recognized that our psychology literature is really primarily based on research that has been conducted with a very specific subset of really the world's population, and even within North America, a subset of the population here. And that really is psychology undergraduate students, right? So that psychology university departments, many researchers rely on what we sometimes call participant pools or various ways of recruiting students that are sort of easily available. But as a result, much of our research literature is based on findings conducted only with these participants, who are a very specific, again, subset. And so recently, a group of authors at the University of British Columbia here in Canada, who are all interested in cultural psychology, have sort of come up, really sort of looked at this systematically and came up with this sort of clever acronym of highlighting them as weird samples. So that is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So really sort of characterizing the context in which these samples live. And then systematically, so then they also systematically highlight, they went through recent literature just showing how the vast majority of samples fit within this characterization, and also how unrepresentative they are of North America and also, of course, of the world.
Yeah, and that's, for those of you who've been following the course, there may have been times at which you've kind of questioned some phenomenon when it didn't sound to you reasonable, given the context that you live in. And that's quite possibly true. It's could very well be a result of the traditional way psychological research has been conducted on this very distinct subgroup of students. So that's really where I think cultural psychology comes in, is trying to step back a little bit and bringing in some of these other factors and trying to understand the role they might play. So maybe you could give us a sense of cultural psychology and what its goals are, and maybe if there's, to the extent there's a history, you could bring in some of that.
Sure. So I think the study of culture and psychology has quite a history, sort of really starting from the beginning of psychology as a discipline itself, and has gone through sort of several different iterations, I think like many subdisciplines within the field. And you highlighted at the start how sometimes we hear about cultural psychology, and sometimes we hear about cross-cultural psychology. And those are sometimes used synonymously, but actually can also be thought of as somewhat distinct traditions within this general interest of looking at culture and psychology. And one way to think about that is that sort of traditionally cross-cultural psychologists have been interested in looking for universals. So taking psychological concepts that primarily have been developed in what we think of as Western contexts, and then seeing how do these look around the world. So paying attention to culture in terms of highlighting the importance of doing cross-cultural comparisons, studying concepts in different countries, but with sort of the overarching objective being an expectation being of finding similarities, and sort of this underlying assumption that ultimately there are a lot of universals.
So I think of an example that I believe we talked about in the context of the course, which is emotional expression, right? Where a lot of people say that generally, if you just look at individuals and how they might express anger or sadness or something like that, it tends to be a universal.
Yeah, so the culture and emotion literature is a fascinating one, and is, I think you're right, a good example where there's evidence for some sort of core universals. There's this idea of a certain subset of emotions being sort of universal emotions, maybe between 5 and 7. It seems that from the evidence we have, there are certain common expressions, like smiling with happiness seems to be quite universal. But at the same time, there's a lot of evidence for pretty substantial cultural variations. So how people express embarrassment, for example, the idea of maybe more social emotions, embarrassment, shame, things like that, being expressed in really substantially different ways. And so that highlights, again, the sort of tension between universals and differences. And so people who identify as cultural psychologists historically have tended to focus more on really looking at context. So the importance of understanding context to understand psychology. And so not making assumptions about universals, but more looking at variation and sort of the profound link between cultural context and psychological processes. And really seeing those as intimately tied, that we can't understand psychology without context.
Yeah, I think the way you put it to me yesterday was something about as the brain develops, it develops within a cultural sphere, and those two things are constantly interacting to shape that individual.
Exactly. So a key tenet within cultural psychology is sort of this phrase that the culture and mind make each other up, so that we can't understand culture without understanding the minds that create culture. But similarly, we can't understand the mind without understanding the cultural context in which it exists.
Right, and this can run pretty deep as well, right? It can affect the way we perceive things. In fact, we were talking about the perception of emotion. Maybe you want to share that example.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I think it's really, been a big contribution of the cultural psychology literature, has been highlighting how profoundly culture matters, that it's not just about sort of more superficial differences around clothing or food, but that it really fundamentally impacts psychological processes. And so again, the culture and emotion literature is an interesting one because emotions seem so fundamental to human experience. And so there's some really neat examples highlighting, again, really important cultural differences. So one that comes to mind that's relatively recent was a group of researchers looking at the perception of emotion faces, let's say, expression of emotion, in Japanese and North American participants. And they in fact used sort of little cartoon figures, and the key gist of it was there was a central figure who had either, let's say, a smiling face or a sad face, and then there were 4 people, so 2 people on either side of that central figure, whose faces either shared the same emotion, so showing the same emotion, or a different emotion. So we can imagine people on either side being sad while the central figure was happy. And so then participants were asked to rate the emotion of the central figure, and the key variable was how much did the faces of the friends, let's say, the people on either side, how much did their faces impact the rating of that central figure's emotion. And so the key finding was that people of Japanese background were more influenced by the surrounding figures when rating that central figure's emotion, whereas the people of Western European background in North America really just paid more attention just to that central figure. And so they looked at this in several different experiments, including eye tracking data to highlight that the Japanese participants indeed were looking more at the context. So pretty neat, and it really ties into a larger literature about how the ideas that people of East Asian backgrounds often take context into account to a greater extent, and highlighting how understandings of emotion can be more sort of social as opposed to more individual.
Yeah, I think that's a cool example. That's cool. You yourself have done some research in this area that relates a lot of cultural issues to mental health issues. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Sure, yeah. So that's my particular area of interest. So I'm a clinical psychologist and a cultural psychologist, and so really most fascinated by sort of the intersection of those fields and in the sort of interdisciplinary area of culture and mental health. And so I guess one theme in my work has been trying to understand cultural differences in the experience of emotional distress and also its expression. And so one key sort of finding in the area of culture and mental health over the years has been differences in the expression of depressive symptoms, and in particular the distinction between more physical or somatic symptoms versus more psychological symptoms. And sort of one finding that people may have heard of is the idea that people of Chinese background tend to emphasize more physical or somatic symptoms when experiencing what we might call depression, compared to sort of the North American norm that we're so familiar with, which really emphasizes psychological symptoms. So that difference has been found repeatedly, but we don't have a great understanding of why. So, what is it that sort of leads to these cultural differences, and what types of symptoms people talk about? What do they talk about when they go to seek help? What do they emphasize, in interviews, etc.? And so one sort of theme within the literature recently has been sort of theories around what contributes to what people pay attention to and what they define as a symptom. And so that ties into what we know about differences in emotion and emotional expression and the importance placed on emotion. And so one idea is that people in North America, there's more of an emphasis on individual emotional experience, thinking quite a lot about how we're feeling, sharing how we're feeling with others. That's sort of, it's welcomed, it's encouraged, right? And there's a contrast in Chinese context where there's less of a focus on those individual emotions. And so there's some theory and some work trying to look at, is that part of what contributes to then differences in symptoms when somebody is distressed.
Cool. I think this all sounds really cool. So by the way, any of you who are interested in hearing more about that, I'll also have a link to a TEDx talk that Jessica gave where she's focusing a lot more on this issue of mental health. And I think the take home from all of this is psychology is a young science. We're still, learning about a lot of things as we go, and it has had some biases in terms of where we've collected our information and who we actually have built a psychology about. And thanks to the work of cultural psychologists, we're now starting to widen that understanding and finding out the extent to which these results do or do not generalize to other populations. So all very cool, all part of being a young, fun science, I think. I want to thank you, Jessica, for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.